The Ladosian's claws dug into Chris's throat, drawing blood. "Please, don't kill me," Chris gurgled, knowing most aliens would snap his neck without a second thought. But the Ladosian captain hesitated. Sirens blared, red lights flashed. The damaged freighter rumbled, ready to explode at any moment. Chris had risked his life to sneak aboard and rescue the wounded Ladosian crew, despite the brutal war raging between their species. Now the alien had him pinned. The ship had minutes before it blew. The stolen quantum cores were lost. Chris's Astro Hawk idled in the docking bay, both their only hope of escape. Chris stared into the Ladosian's reptilian eyes, pulse racing. Would this act of compassion be his end? The alien's grip loosened. "I won't kill you, human," Captain Cygnus said. "Your kind may be my enemy, but you risked your own skin to save me and my men. That's the honorable thing. I owe you a debt." He pulled Chris to his feet. Together they raced for the airlock as the ship groaned and imploded behind them. Fire chased their heels. The Astro Hawk barely blasted free before the freighter burst into a ball of plasma. Chris's hands shook on the controls as they rocketed away. He'd only investigated the distress beacon out of basic decency. He never expected to be saving lizard lives today. Funny how the universe worked. "Well, human, seems we're stuck together for now," Cygnus said, slumping into the co-pilot seat and nursing a bleeding head wound. "At least until I figure out who attacked my ship and stole those cores. Then I'll be out of your fringe." Chris sighed. Helping Ladosians definitely broke some rules, but leaving them to die would have broken his conscience. "Fine, let's get you patched up first. But if your pirate pals come looking for trouble, I'm shoving you out the airlock." He meant it as a joke, but Cygnus just narrowed his eyes. "Fair enough." Chris set course for a neutral station, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Seems his good deed was just the start of a longer journey into dangerous territory. Hopefully his human ingenuity would be enough to keep them both alive, because the ruthless Crimson Claws were still out there, and they played for keeps. The Astro Hawk rocketed through hyperspace, stars streaking past the cockpit windows. Cygnus slumped in the co-pilot seat, his reptilian scales slick with sweat, as Chris tended to his wounds. The human's hands moved deftly, cleaning and dressing the gashes with practiced efficiency. "Those quantum cores," Chris said, breaking the tense silence. "What exactly do they do?" Cygnus grimaced, his claws flexing. "They're the heart of our AI systems. Military, infrastructure, everything. If the Crimson Claws crack the encryption, they could bring our defenses to their knees." Chris's jaw tightened. The stakes were higher than he'd thought. He punched in the coordinates for Zeta Prime, the engines humming as they accelerated. They dropped out of hyperspace above the verdant world, its surface dotted with gleaming Ladosian cities. But as they approached the capital, a squadron of sleek fighters rose to meet them, weapons hot. "Unidentified vessel, state your business or be destroyed," a harsh voice crackled over the comms. Cygnus leaned forward, his voice strained. "This is Captain Cygnus of the Ladosian Defense Force. I have urgent news for Governor Alara." There was a tense pause, then, "You may land, but we will escort you to the surface. Any deviation, and we will open fire." Chris gritted his teeth as he guided the Astro Hawk down, the fighters hovering close like angry wasps. As they touched down, a contingent of heavily armed Ladosian soldiers surrounded the ship, led by a scarred male who radiated hostility. "I am Commander Zorn," he growled as Chris and Cygnus disembarked. "What business does a human have here?" Cygnus stepped forward, his posture proud despite his injuries. "This human saved my life. He has information vital to our survival." Zorn's eyes narrowed, his claws twitching towards his sidearm. But after a long, tense moment, he jerked his head towards a waiting transport. "Very well, but one wrong move, human, and I'll gut you myself." The governor's palace was a sprawling structure of gleaming metal and glass, its halls echoing with the click of claws on polished stone. Alara was waiting for them in her office, her scales a rich emerald green, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Governor, the Crimson Claws have stolen a shipment of quantum cores," Cygnus said without preamble. They attacked my freighter and left us for dead. If we don't recover those cores, they'll use our own AI against us, Ilara finished grimly. This human, you trust him? Chris met her gaze unflinchingly. With respect, ma'am, I didn't have to come here. I could have left Cygnus to die. But I didn't. Because this isn't about humans or Ladosians anymore. It's about stopping a bunch of extremist lunatics from burning down the galaxy. Ilara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Cygnus. Captain, you will work with this human to track down the Crimson Claws and recover those cores. Use whatever resources you need, but do it quickly. If they crack our encryption... She trailed off as a sudden boom rocked the palace, alarms blaring to life. Soldiers rushed past, shouting orders as the ground shook beneath their feet. Zorn burst into the office, his face grim. Governor, we're under attack. Crimson Claw ships, a whole damn fleet of them. They're bombarding the city from orbit. Chris and Cygnus shared a look of pure dread. They were too late. The Crimson Claws were here. Without a word, they turned and sprinted for the landing pad, explosions and screams echoing in their wake. The Astrohawk was already powering up as they leaped aboard, Chris's hands flying over the controls. We have to get up there, Cygnus snarled, strapping himself in. We have to take out those ships before they level the whole damn colony. Chris nodded grimly, his jaw set as he guided the Astrohawk into the chaos of battle. Crimson Claw fighters swarmed like angry insects, energy beams crisscrossing the sky as the colony's defenses struggled to hold them back. But the Astrohawk was fast and nimble, darting through the maelstrom of fire and fury like a silver fish. Chris gripped the controls, his eyes hard as he lined up a Crimson Claw frigate in his sights. Hang on to your scales, he growled and pulled the trigger. The Astrohawk's lasers sliced through the void of space, spearing a Crimson Claw fighter. It erupted in a ball of fire. Chris yanked the controls, sending the nimble ship into a corkscrew. A trio of enemy fighters roared past, their shots going wide. The space around Zeta Prime was a maelstrom of destruction. Ladosian and Crimson Claw ships traded fire, explosions lighting the darkness. But the colony's defenses were crumbling. Escape pods streaked away from the planet, desperate to reach safety. We need to cover those civilian transports, Chris barked, angling the Astrohawk towards a cluster of pods. A Crimson Claw frigate bore down on them, its guns glowing red. Cygnus's claws flew over the weapons console. A salvo of missiles streaked from the Astrohawk's tubes, slamming into the frigate's shields. They flickered and died. The human ship's advanced weaponry, designed for surgical strikes, punched through the weakened armor. The frigate staggered, venting atmosphere. Good hit, Chris crowed. He swung the Astrohawk around, peppering the crippled ship with laser fire until it cracked apart. But their victory was short-lived. A massive Crimson Claw warship, bristling with cannon, loomed out of the chaos. It locked onto the Astrohawk, a lance of energy stabbing from its prow. The beam clipped the human ship's engines. Alarms blared, smoke filled the cockpit. We're hit! Cygnus snarled, his claws scrabbling at the sparking panels. The warship bore down on them, its guns charging for a final, killing blow. Chris gritted his teeth, knowing they couldn't outrun it. This was the end. Suddenly, a new wave of ships dropped out of hyperspace. Sleek and silver, emblazoned with the crest of Earth. Weapons fire erupted from their flanks, stitching across the warship's hull. The behemoth reeled, its shields shattering under the onslaught. Attention Astrohawk, this is Admiral Nora Donovan of the USS Artemis. Heard you could use a hand, little brother. Chris gaped at the comm panel. Nora? What the hell are you doing here? Saving your ass, apparently. The Galactic Council has declared the Crimson Claws a terrorist organization. We're here to bring them down. Together. The human fleet tore into the Crimson Claw ships with ruthless efficiency. Outmatched and outgunned, the rogue Ladosians were forced to retreat, jumping away into hyperspace. As the battle ended, escape pods docking with rescue ships, a sense of relief washed over Chris. They had won the day, but the fight was far from over. Admiral, I have a Ladosian captain here with critical intel on the Crimson Claws, Chris said into the comm. Permission to come aboard? Granted, we have a lot to discuss. The Astro Hawk, its engines limping, angled towards the Artemis's hangar bay. As they crossed the threshold, Cygnus turned to Chris, his reptilian eyes intense. I suppose I should thank you, human. You saved many Ladosian lives today. Chris shrugged. Just doing what's right. Like I said, this is bigger than just humans and Ladosians now. The Crimson Claws are a threat to everyone. Cygnus nodded, his scales glinting in the light. Indeed, and it seems our fates are intertwined in stopping them. An unlikely alliance, but a necessary one. The Astrohawk settled onto the deck with a hiss of hydraulics. As the ramp lowered, Chris saw Nora striding towards them, her admiral's uniform crisp and pressed. Beside her was a tall Ladosian in the robes of a diplomat. Chris, Captain Cygnus, allow me to introduce Ambassador Kareem of the Galactic Council, Nora said. He has a proposition for you both. Kareem inclined his head, his voice deep and resonant. The Council has authorized the formation of a joint task force to track down and eliminate the Crimson Claws. We need the best and brightest from both our species to succeed, and you two have proven yourselves more than capable. Chris glanced at Cygnus, seeing the same determination in the Ladosian's eyes that he felt in his own heart. This was their chance to make a real difference, to protect the innocent and bring justice to the guilty. We're in, Chris said, extending his hand to Kareem. When do we start? The ambassador smiled, his teeth glinting. Immediately. The Crimson Claws have already caused too much destruction. It's time we put an end to their reign of terror, once and for all. As the group strode deeper into the Artemis, Chris felt a sense of purpose settle over him. The Battle of Zeta Prime was over, but the war had only just begun. The Artemis's briefing room was abuzz with activity as the joint task force assembled. Chris and Cygnus stood at the head of the table, eyes scanning the faces of their new allies. Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, a broad-shouldered human with a crooked grin, nodded in greeting. Beside him sat Zara, her Ladosian scales gleaming under the harsh lights, her gaze sharp and calculating. All right, listen up, Admiral Donovan barked, striding into the room. We have a lead on the Crimson Claws. Intel suggests they're holed up in an asteroid field in the Kepler-62 system. Our mission is to flush them out and recover those quantum cores. Chris leaned forward, his jaw set. What's the plan of attack? We'll approach the field under cloak, Donovan said, pulling up a holographic map. Once we're in range, Chris and Reeves will lead a fighter squadron to draw out their defenses. Cygnus and Zara will coordinate from the bridge. We hit them hard and fast, no mercy. The task force nodded, faces grim with determination. They knew the stakes, the lives on the line. Failure was not an option. As the Artemis dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the asteroid field, alarms blared to life. Multiple contacts, Zara shouted from her console. Crimson Claw ships, coming out of stealth. The bridge erupted into chaos as the enemy ships opened fire, their cannons tearing through the void. The Artemis shuddered under the onslaught, shields straining. Launch fighters, Donovan ordered, gripping the command chair. Chris, Reeves, get out there and take those bastards down. Chris and Reeves sprinted to the hangar bay, leaping into their fighters. The sleek ships roared to life, shooting out into the maelstrom of battle. Laser fire crisscrossed the space around them, explosions blooming like deadly flowers. Form up on me, Chris barked into the comm, his hands flying over the controls. We need to take out those gunships. The fighters dove and weaved through the asteroids, locked in a deadly dance with the Crimson Claw ships. Chris gritted his teeth as he lined up a shot, his lasers slicing through an enemy fighter. It erupted in a ball of fire, debris pinging off his shields. But the Crimson Claws were ready for them, their ships darting out from behind the rocks like vipers. A heavy cannon swung towards Chris's fighter, energy building in its barrel. Chris, watch out, Reeves shouted, but it was too late. The cannon fired, a lance of searing light. Chris wrenched the controls, the beam missing him by inches, but his wingman wasn't so lucky. The fighter beside him vanished in a flash of burning metal. "No!" Chris screamed, anger and grief welling up inside him. He spun his ship around, cannons blazing, tearing into the Crimson Claw ship with ruthless fury. On the bridge of the Artemis, Cygnus and Zara worked frantically to coordinate the battle. The ship rocked under the unrelenting assault, consoles sparking and smoking. "We can't take much more of this," Zara snarled, her claws flying over the controls. Cygnus stared at the tactical display, his mind racing. Then his eyes widened. "There!" He jabbed a claw at the screen. "That warship is coordinating their attacks. If we take it out..." "The rest will scatter," Donovan finished grimly. "Helm, bring us about. Divert all power to forward cannons." The Artemis surged forward, its prow aimed straight at the Crimson Claw warship. The enemy ship loomed before them, its guns swiveling to face the new threat. But Chris was already in motion, his fighters screaming towards the warship's bridge. He dodged and rolled, the ship's point defenses filling the space around him with deadly light. With a final, desperate yell, he fired his last torpedoes and pulled away, praying they would find their mark. The warship erupted in a blinding flash, its hull cracking apart like an egg. The Crimson Claw ships faltered, their coordination gone. Seizing the chance, the task force pressed the attack, hammering the enemy with everything they had. But even as the last Crimson Claw ship fled into hyperspace, the Artemis shuddered and groaned. Alarms blared, red lights flashing. "Report!" Donovan barked, dread filling her voice. "Main power core is failing," Zara called, her eyes wide. "Some kind of sabotage. If we don't contain the damage..." She didn't need to finish. They all knew what would happen. The Artemis would explode, taking them all with it. Chris and Cygnus shared a look of pure terror as they raced through the halls, the ship shaking itself apart around them. They had minutes, maybe less, to stop the cascade before it consumed them all. The fate of the task force and the war hung in the balance as they charged towards the engine room, hearts pounding in their chests. Chris and Marcus raced through the USS Artemis's shattered corridors, the ship shuddering and groaning around them. They suited up in sleek, armored exoskeletons, the metal plates locking into place with hydraulic hisses. "Main power core is going critical," Marcus said grimly, his voice crackling over the helmet comms. "If we don't shut it down..." "I know," Chris said, jaw clenched. "Let's move." They cycled through the airlock, the outer doors slamming open to the cold vacuum of space. Debris swirled past, glittering shards of metal and plastic. The power core loomed ahead, a pulsing mass of energy, arcs of electricity lashing from its surface. Chris and Marcus jetted forward, weaving through the maze of wreckage. Plasma geysered from ruptured conduits. Electrical discharges crackled past, ionizing the air. They dodged and rolled, hearts pounding. On the bridge, Cygnus and Zara worked desperately to stabilize the ship. Alarms blared, consoles sparking. "Reroute power from the secondary grid," Cygnus barked, claws flying over the controls. "Boost the containment fields." Zara hissed in frustration, her screen flashing red. "The system's not responding, that damned virus." "Keep trying. If we don't regain control..." The ship juddered, throwing them against their restraints. On the hull, Chris and Marcus reached the power core housing. They mag-locked to the surface, hands moving in practiced motions. "Starting manual shutdown," Chris reported, typing commands into his wrist console. "Venting plasma in 3, 2... A shadow fell over them, a figure in stolen Ladosian exo-armor, crimson insignia emblazoned on its chest plate. The Crimson Claw infiltrator. "You!" Marcus snarled, raising his pulse rifle. The infiltrator lunged, a blade of crackling energy extending from their gauntlet. Marcus fired, the shot sparking off the infiltrator's shields. They crashed together, grappling in the zero-G. Chris worked frantically at the console, rerouting the shutdown sequence. The core pulsed faster, dangerously unstable. Marcus and the infiltrator slammed against the housing, locked in desperate combat. Zara slammed her fist on the console, eyes widening. "I've isolated the virus. Purging now." The ship's systems blinked, stuttered, then surged back to life. On the hull, The final command sequence locked into place. The power core dimmed, shuddered, then went dark. The USS Artemis stabilized, backup power thrumming through its veins. Chris and Marcus hauled the unconscious infiltrator back through the airlock, the adrenaline fading. As the task force regrouped on the bridge, a transmission crackled across the view screen. "This is Epsilon 9 colony. We're under attack. Massive Crimson Claw fleet. They're bombarding the surface. We need..." The transmission cut to static. Admiral Donovan's face hardened, eyes flashing. "Set course for Epsilon 9, maximum speed," she ordered. "I want damage control teams working round the clock. We may be battered, but we're not beaten. Not while there are innocent lives at stake." The USS Artemis leaped to warp, racing towards the besieged colony, the joint task force steeling themselves for the battle to come. The war against the Crimson Claws was far from over. The USS Artemis dropped out of warp above Epsilon 9, alarms blaring as the view screen filled with the chaos of battle. Crimson Claw ships swarmed the colony, hammering its defenses with relentless bombardment. Fires raged across the settlement's surface, buildings crumbling under the onslaught. "All hands to battle stations," Admiral Donovan barked, her face grim. "Launch fighters. Chris, take your squadron and draw their fire. We need to give the colony a chance to evacuate." Chris nodded, already sprinting for the hangar bay. He leaped into his fighter, the engines roaring to life. His squadron formed up around him, a mix of human and Ledosian pilots. They shot out into the maelstrom, lasers blazing. "Break formation and engage at will," Chris ordered, juking his fighter hard to port. A Crimson Claw ship filled his sights. He squeezed the trigger, his shot stitching across its hull. The enemy ship exploded, shrapnel pinging off Chris's shields. On the Artemis's bridge, Cygnus and Zara worked furiously to coordinate with the colony's defenses. "Commander Zarin, this is the USS Artemis," Cygnus said, the comms crackling. "We're here to assist. What's your status?" "Thank the stars you're here." Zarin's voice was strained, the sounds of battle echoing in the background. "We're trying to get civilians to the underground bunkers, but the Crimson Claws are hitting us hard. We need more time." "Understood," Zara replied, her claws flying over the console. "We're sending ground teams to help establish a perimeter. Just focus on the evacuation." As the space battle raged, dropships disgorged from the Crimson Claw vessels, hurtling towards the colony's surface. They slammed into the ground, hatches slamming open to reveal heavily armed soldiers and combat drones. They surged forward, weapons spitting death. Chris swore, angling his fighter into a steep dive. His squadron followed, strafing the invaders with blistering salvos. Explosions bloomed, the ground erupting in geysers of dirt and fire. But the Crimson Claws kept coming, advancing relentlessly. In the heart of the colony, Marcus led a mixed team of human and Ledosian soldiers towards the main power plant. Its towering reactors were the key to the bunker's life support systems. If they fell, the civilians were doomed. "Set up a perimeter!" Marcus shouted, his rifle barking. Crimson Claw drones swarmed towards them, all flashing metal and whirring blades. The soldiers took cover, pouring fire into the mechanical horde. But the enemy pressed forward, heedless of losses. Marcus watched in horror as a drone leaped onto a Ledosian soldier, saw blades screaming. The soldier fell, blood pooling on the ground. "Fall back!" Marcus ordered, laying down a withering barrage. "Into the power plant! We'll make our stand there!" They fought their way into the control room, sealing the blast doors behind them. The Crimson Claws hammered at the barriers, the metal denting under the assault. "We can't hold them for long," a Ledosian soldier said, her voice tight with fear. Marcus gritted his teeth, watching the monitors. The reactors pulsed with energy, vital and vulnerable. He keyed his comms. "Chris, we need air support at the power plant now. We're about to be overrun." "On my way," Chris's voice crackled. "Just hang on." But as the minutes ticked by and the doors buckled under the relentless attack, Marcus felt despair creeping in. They were out of time. The Crimson Claws would break through, and the colony would fall. Suddenly the ground shook with the thunder of orbital bombardment. But it wasn't the Crimson Claws firing. A new fleet of Ledosian ships dropped out of warp, guns blazing as they tore into the enemy's rear. "This is Commander Zorn of the Ledosian Defense Force," a voice crackled over the comms. "Heard you could use a hand, Artemis." Chris whooped as Zorn's fleet smashed into the Crimson Claws like a hammer, catching them utterly off guard. The USS Artemis surged forward to join the attack, the two forces trapping the enemy between them. The Crimson Claw ships reeled under the onslaught, hulls shattering, engines exploding. One by one they fell, torn apart or forced to surrender. The tide had turned. In the power plant, Marcus heard the sounds of battle fading. He glanced at his soldiers, battered but determined. "All right, people," he said, hefting his rifle. "Time to take back our colony." They burst from the control room, charging into the ranks of the Crimson Claws. The enemy soldiers, suddenly cut off and desperate, fought back viciously, but they were no match for the combined might of the human and Ledosian forces. The battle raged through the streets, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burnt metal, but inch by bloody inch, the Allies pushed the Crimson Claws back, and as the last enemy soldier fell, a ragged cheer went up from the weary defenders. In the aftermath, the task force regrouped at the heart of the colony, assessing the damage. Buildings lay in ruins, fires still smoldering. The wounded were carried to triage centers, medics working frantically to save lives. Chris and Cygnus picked their way through the rubble, faces grim. The cost had been high, but Epsilon 9 still stood. The Crimson Claws had been dealt a crushing blow. As they passed a group of captured enemy soldiers, Chris paused. The prisoners glared back at him with hate-filled eyes, but he saw fear there too. "Get these scum to the brig," he ordered the guards. "I want them interrogated. We need to find out where the Crimson Claws are hiding and what they're planning next." Cygnus nodded, his expression hard. "We hurt them today, but this war is far from over. We must be ready for their next move." Chris clenched his fists, the ache of loss and the fire of determination warring in his heart. The Crimson Claws had brought untold suffering to the galaxy, and he would not rest until they were brought to justice, no matter the cost. The task force turned to the long, grim work of rebuilding and preparing for the battles to come, the smoke of Epsilon 9 still rising behind them. In the brig of the USS Artemis, the captured Crimson Claw soldiers sat in sullen silence, their eyes filled with hatred and defiance. Chris and Cygnus stood before them, flanked by a pair of heavily armed guards. "Start talking," Chris growled, his voice low and menacing. "What's your next move? Where are your bases?" The prisoners remained tight-lipped, their expressions stony. But as the interrogation dragged on, one of the soldiers, a young Ledosian with a nasty scar across his snout, finally cracked. "You're too late," he spat, his eyes gleaming with malice. "The Crimson Claws are already on the move. They're going to hit the Galactic Council Summit on Novus Prime, take out the leaders, the whole alliance, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Chris and Cygnus exchanged a look of pure dread. The Galactic Council Summit was a crucial meeting between human and Ledosian leaders, a chance to strengthen the bonds between their species in the face of the Crimson Claw threat. If the terrorists succeeded in their attack, it could shatter the alliance and plunge the galaxy into chaos. "When is this attack supposed to happen?" Cygnus demanded, his claws flexing with barely contained rage. The prisoner smirked, his teeth bared in a vicious grin. "Soon. Very soon. And when it does, the Crimson Claws will rise from the ashes, and the galaxy will be ours." Chris slammed his fist against the cell door, the metal ringing with the impact. They had to act fast, or countless lives would be lost. "Zara, Marcus, get to the bridge," he barked into his comms. "We need to set course for Novus Prime now." The USS Artemis leaped into hyperspace, racing towards the distant world. As they approached the planet, they were greeted by a massive fleet of human and Ledosian ships, their hulls bristling with weapons. "Artemis, this is Novus Prime Defense Control," a gruff voice crackled over the comms. "State your business." "This is Admiral Donovan of the Joint Task Force," Nora replied, her voice stern. "We have urgent intelligence regarding an imminent Crimson Claw attack on the Galactic Council Summit. Request permission to land and coordinate with planetary security." There was a tense pause, then, "Permission granted, Artemis. Proceed to Landing Bay Alpha 6. Defense teams will meet you there." As the USS Artemis touched down, Chris and Cygnus were greeted by a tall Ladosian with a heavily scarred face and piercing eyes. He was flanked by a dozen armed soldiers, their weapons held at the ready. "I am Corvin, head of the Galactic Council's security detail," the Ladosian said, his voice a low rumble. "I understand you have information about a possible attack?" Chris nodded grimly. "The Crimson Claws are planning to hit the summit, take out key leaders. We need to lock down the conference hall and secure the perimeter now." Corvin's eyes narrowed, his claws twitching towards his sidearm. "We've received no such intelligence. How do I know this isn't some kind of trick?" Cygnus stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Corvin, I am Captain Cygnus of the Ladosian Defense Force. I give you my word, this threat is real. We captured Crimson Claw soldiers who confirmed the attack. Please, we must act now, or countless lives will be lost." Corvin hesitated, his gaze searching Cygnus's face. Then slowly he nodded. "Very well. We will place the summit on lockdown and deploy additional security teams. But mark my words, if this turns out to be a false alarm, there will be consequences." The conference hall was a vast, sprawling structure of gleaming metal and glass, its halls echoing with the chatter of dozens of different species. Representatives from across the galaxy had gathered here to discuss matters of trade, defense, and diplomacy. But now, an air of tension hung over the proceedings, as news of the Crimson Claw threat spread like wildfire. Security teams patrolled the halls, weapons at the ready, while nervous attendees huddled in small groups, whispering anxiously. Chris and Marcus took up position outside the main auditorium, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Cygnus and Zara worked with Corvin to coordinate the planet's defenses, poring over security feeds and sensor data. Suddenly, a series of explosions rocked the building, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Alarms blared, the sound of shattering glass and screams filling the air. "We're under attack!" Corvin shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Crimson Claw forces have breached the perimeter!" Chris and Marcus charged into the fray, weapons drawn. They moved through the panicked crowds, scanning for threats, their hearts pounding in their chests. A group of Crimson Claw soldiers burst into the auditorium, their weapons spitting fire. Dignitaries and representatives dove for cover, screaming in terror. Chris and Marcus opened fire, cutting down the attackers in a hail of gunfire. But more kept coming, pouring in from all sides. They were well-armed and well-trained, moving with brutal efficiency. Chris and Marcus fought with everything they had, but they were badly outnumbered. "We need backup," Marcus shouted, ducking behind a pillar as a barrage of laser fire stitched the wall behind him. "Corvin, where are those reinforcements?" Chris yelled into his comms, his voice ragged with exertion. But the only response was static, the signal jammed by the Crimson Claw's advanced tech. They were on their own, fighting a desperate battle against an enemy that seemed to have planned for every contingency. As the battle raged on, Cygnus and Zara worked frantically to coordinate the planet's defenses, trying to track down the source of the stolen security codes. But everywhere they turned, they found only dead ends and false leads. "This doesn't make sense," Zara growled, her claws flying over the console. "The Crimson Claws couldn't have gotten those codes on their own. Someone must have helped them, someone with high-level access." Cygnus's eyes widened, a sudden realization dawning on him. "Zara, cross-reference the access logs with the Council's personnel files. Look for any discrepancies, any unusual activity." Zara nodded, her fingers already flying over the keys. The minutes ticked by, the sounds of battle echoing through the halls. Chris and Marcus fought on, their bodies aching with fatigue, their armor scorched and dented. Then a chime from Zara's console, a flashing red alert. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock and anger. "Cygnus, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling with rage. The stolen codes, the security breaches, they all trace back to one person, someone on the council itself. Cygnus leaned in, his eyes scanning the data. And there, in stark black and white, was a name he had never expected to see, a name that sent a chill down his spine, a surge of betrayal and fury through his veins. The Crimson Claws had an ally on the inside, someone who had been working against them all along, and now, that traitor's actions threatened to bring the entire galaxy to its knees. Chris and Cygnus raced through the shattered halls of the conference center, their hearts pounding in their chests. The name Ethan Novak burned in their minds, a traitor in their midst. They burst into the main auditorium, weapons drawn. Novak stood on the stage, a detonator clutched in his wrinkled hand. The dignitaries cowered before him, a human shield against the task force's fury. Chris's eyes narrowed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Novak!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "It's over. Surrender now, and no one else has to get hurt." The old man laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "You're too late, boy. The Crimson Claws will rise, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Surrender, or I'll turn this city into a crater." Cygnus hissed, his scales bristling with rage. "You're insane, Novak. How could you betray your own people like this?" "My people?" Novak spat. "The Council is weak, a relic of a bygone era. The Crimson Claws are the future, and I intend to be on the winning side." As Chris and Cygnus tried to reason with the madman, Marcus and Zara crept through the city's underbelly, tracking the bomb's energy signatures. They moved in silence, their weapons at the ready. A squad of Crimson Claw drones rounded the corner, their optical sensors glowing red. Marcus dropped to one knee, his rifle barking. The drones exploded in a shower of sparks and shrapnel. Zara lunged forward, her claws slicing through a tangle of wires. "That's another one down, but there's still more out there." Marcus nodded grimly. "We're running out of time. We have to move faster." Back in the auditorium, Chris and Cygnus were locked in a tense standoff with Novak. The traitor's eyes darted between them, his finger hovering over the detonator. "Think about what you're doing, Novak," Chris said, his voice low and steady. "You're about to murder thousands of innocent people. Is that really what you want your legacy to be?" For a moment, Novak hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but then his expression hardened, his eyes burning with zealous fire. "I'm doing what needs to be done," he snarled, "for the greater good." Chris's calm crackled to life, Marcus's voice tight with urgency. "Chris, we've disarmed most of the bombs, but there's one more, right beneath your feet. You need to get everyone out of there now." Chris and Cygnus shared a look of pure dread. They were out of time. With a roar of fury, they charged the stage, weapons blazing. Novak's guards opened fire, energy bolts scorching the air. Chris dove behind a row of seats, popping up to pick off the guards one by one. Cygnus leaped onto the stage, his claws flashing as he grappled with Novak. The two rolled across the floor, trading blows. Novak was old, but he fought with the strength of a man possessed. He lashed out with the detonator, catching Cygnus across the snout. The Ladosian reeled back, blood dripping from his scales. Chris surged forward, slamming into Novak with the force of a freight train. They crashed to the ground, the detonator skidding across the stage. Novak scrambled for the device, his fingers clawing at the polished wood. But Chris was faster. He snatched up the detonator, crushing it beneath his boot. Novak howled in rage, his eyes wild. He lunged at Chris, his hands reaching for the human's throat. But Chris was ready for him. He ducked under Novak's grasp, driving his fist into the traitor's gut. Novak doubled over, gasping for breath. Chris followed up with a devastating uppercut, snapping Novak's head back. The old man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Cygnus limped over, clutching his wounded snout. "The bomb!" he rasped. "We have to disarm it!" Chris nodded, already moving. He leaped off the stage, tearing at the floorboards with desperate strength. The bomb lay beneath, its countdown flashing red. Cygnus knelt beside him, his claws steady as he worked to disarm the device. Sweat dripped down Chris's face as he watched the Ladosian work, the seconds ticking away. With a final twist of his claws, Cygnus sat back, exhaling heavily. It's done. The bomb is disarmed. Chris slumped against the stage, relief flooding through him. They had done it. The summit was safe, the Crimson Claw's plot foiled. But as he looked around at the shattered auditorium, the wounded and terrified dignitaries, he knew their work was far from over. Novak's betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg, a symptom of a much larger problem. The task force gathered around the traitor's unconscious form, their faces grim. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. And as they sifted through the evidence of Novak's treachery, the sheer scope of the conspiracy began to take shape. Secret meetings, encrypted transmissions, backdoor deals with the Crimson Claws. Novak's fingerprints were everywhere, a web of lies and deceit that stretched back years. Chris clenched his jaw, a cold fury burning in his gut. Novak had betrayed everything the Council stood for, everything they had fought and bled to protect. And he wouldn't rest until every last conspirator was brought to justice, no matter how high up the chain they went. The task force set to work, poring over the data, tracking down leads. They had a long road ahead of them, but they were ready for the fight, because this was bigger than just humans and Ledosians now. This was about the fate of the entire galaxy and the brave few who stood against the darkness no matter the cost. The interrogation room was a stark, cold place, the air heavy with the weight of Novak's betrayal. Chris and Cygnus stood before the traitor, their faces hardened with resolve. Novak spilled his secrets like a burst dam, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate bid for mercy. The Crimson Claws, they have a base on Sigma Draconis, he babbled, his eyes wide with fear. They're developing a biological weapon there, something that can target specific species. You have to stop them. Chris and Cygnus shared a look of grim determination. They gathered the task force, briefing them on the mission ahead. Zara's claws flexed with anticipation, while Marcus checked his weapons with a steely focus. The USS Artemis sliced through the void, Sigma Draconis growing larger in the view screen. The planet was a sickly green, its atmosphere a roiling mass of toxic clouds. The team donned their exo-armor, the suits hissing and clicking as they sealed against the deadly environment. The shuttle touched down in a remote canyon, the rocks shielding them from prying eyes. Chris took point, his armor's cloaking field shimmering as he moved through the shadows. The others followed, their footsteps muffled by the suit's dampeners. As they neared the base, a patrol of Crimson Claw soldiers emerged from the mists, their weapons at the ready. Chris held up a fist, signaling the team to halt. They crouched behind a cluster of boulders, waiting for the enemy to pass. But the soldiers were too alert, too well-trained. One of them paused, his head cocked as if listening for something. Chris cursed under his breath, knowing they had only moments before they were discovered. He burst from cover, his rifle spitting plasma. The soldiers reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. The air was filled with the shrill of lasers and the thud of bullets against rock. Chris and his team moved with fluid grace, their armor's enhanced reflexes allowing them to outmaneuver the enemy. Marcus flanked left, his shotgun booming as he closed in on a group of soldiers. Zara leaped over a boulder, her claws flashing as she carved through the Crimson Claws like a hot knife through butter. Cygnus focused his fire on the patrol's leader, his shots precise and deadly. The soldier fell, his armor smoking. Chris was on him in an instant, his armored boot pinning the man to the ground. "The base, what are its defenses?" he snarled, his rifle pressed against the soldier's faceplate. The man spat a curse, but Chris increased the pressure, the armor's servos whining. "Talk, or I'll crush your skull like an egg." The soldier broke, his words spilling out in a panicked rush. Chris listened intently, committing every detail to memory. When the man finished, Chris knocked him unconscious with a swift blow to the head. The team regrouped, their armor splattered with blood and scorch marks. Chris relayed the information he had gathered, his mind racing with possibilities. "We'll split up," he said, his voice firm with command. "Marcus and I will hit the main entrance, draw their fire. Cygnus, Zara, you infiltrate the research labs and find that weapon. We'll buy you as much time as we can. The team nodded, their faces set with grim resolve. They moved out, the base looming before them like a malevolent presence. Chris and Marcus charged the front gates, their weapons blazing. The Crimson Claws responded with a hail of fire, energy beams and rockets filling the air. The two humans ducked and weaved, their armor deflecting the worst of the barrage. They fought their way into the base, the corridors ringing with the sound of battle. Crimson Claw soldiers poured from every doorway, their weapons spitting death. Chris and Marcus met them head-on, their armor's strength and speed turning them into living battering rams. Meanwhile, Cygnus and Zara crept through the base's ventilation shafts, their armor's cloaking fields rendering them all but invisible. They emerged in the heart of the research labs, the air thick with the stench of chemicals and decay. What they found there was a nightmare made flesh, rows of containment tanks, each one housing a writhing, mutated horror. Ledosian test subjects, their bodies twisted and deformed by the Crimson Claw's experiments. And there, in the center of it all, the weapon itself. A virus designed to target the Ledosian genome with ruthless precision. Cygnus's blood ran cold as he read the data scrolling across the screens. This was no mere bioweapon, but a tool of genocide, a means to eradicate his entire species. Zara downloaded the data, her claws flying across the console, but as they turned to leave, the doors hissed open, revealing a squad of Crimson Claw scientists and their genetically enhanced bodyguards. The scientists were pale and gaunt, their eyes glittering with madness. The bodyguards were hulking brutes, their muscles bulging beneath their armor, their faces contorted with rage. "You shouldn't have come here," one of the scientists said, his voice a rasping whisper. "Now you will die, along with the rest of your pathetic race." Cygnus and Zara looked at each other, their faces hardening with resolve. Cygnus roared, his claws ripping through a bodyguard's armor. Zara ducked under a scientist's wild swing, her own claws finding flesh. Blood spattered the lab's sterile walls. But the Crimson Claws kept coming, a tide of fanatical fury. Cygnus and Zara fought back to back, their exo-armor's servos whining with each blow. A super soldier slammed into Cygnus, knocking him to the floor. The Ledosian rolled, barely avoiding a crushing stomp. Zara leaped over a console, data disk clutched in her claws. She jammed it into a port, fingers flying over the keys. "Downloading now! Cover me!" Cygnus surged to his feet, tackling the super soldier. They crashed into a bank of equipment, sparks flying. Cygnus pummeled the bodyguard's face, his armored fists cracking bone. But more poured into the lab, their weapons spitting fire. Zara cried out as a laser seared her shoulder. Cygnus flung the broken super soldier aside, lunging to her defense. It wasn't enough. The Crimson Claws swarmed them, clawed hands tearing at their armor. Cygnus felt his strength waning, his blood pooling in his suit. Suddenly, the lab door blew inward, smoke and debris filling the air. Chris and Marcus charged through the gap, their rifles roaring. Crimson Claws fell, bodies shredded by the onslaught. "Move!" Chris shouted, laying down a withering barrage. Cygnus hauled Zara to her feet, snatching the data disk. They sprinted for the door, Marcus and Chris covering their retreat. Laser fire chased them through the corridors, alarms blaring. More Crimson Claws poured from every junction, their howls of rage echoing off the walls. The team fought like demons, their weapons flashing, exo-armor drenched in blood. They reached the hangar, diving into their waiting shuttle. Chris leaped into the pilot's seat, hands flying over the controls. The engines roared to life, the shuttle lifting off in a blast of thrusters. But as they tore through the atmosphere, the sensors screamed a warning. "Incoming fighters!" Marcus snarled, manning the weapons console. A swarm of Crimson Claw attack ships dropped out of orbit, their guns blazing. The shuttle shuddered as lasers pounded its shields. Chris wrenched the controls, sending them into a corkscrew dive. Space lit up with deadly light, ships swirling in a dance of destruction. Chris jinked and rolled, narrowly evading the enemy's fire. Marcus and Zara unleashed a storm of missiles and laser fire, crimson claw ships erupting into flames. In the rear of the shuttle, Cygnus hunched over a console, his claws a blur as he worked to decrypt the stolen data. The biological weapon's schematics flickered across the screen, a twisting helix of death. "I'm reading a massive energy spike," Zara called out, her voice tight with fear. "They're charging some kind of superweapon." Chris swore, wrenching the shuttle into a desperate climb. The Crimson Claw flagship loomed before them, its hull bristling with cannon. A seething ball of plasma gathered at its prow, the air shimmering with heat. Suddenly, the comm crackled to life, a distorted voice filling the cabin. "Attention, human vessel. This is the Ladosian colony of New Tarsus. We are under heavy Crimson Claw attack. They're slaughtering civilians. Please, we need immediate assistance." Chris felt his blood run cold. The colony was light years away, in the opposite direction of the flagship. If they diverted now, the Crimson Claws would escape with the bioweapon data. But if they didn't... "Chris, we have to help them," Marcus shouted, his face anguished. "We can't just leave them to die." Chris gritted his teeth, his mind racing. The flagship's superweapon glowed brighter, the shuttle's hull starting to blister. They had seconds to decide. "Cygnus, Zara, keep working on that data," Chris ordered, his voice like steel. "Marcus and I will take the second shuttle. Try to buy New Tarsus some time." "But Chris," Zara started. "No buts. We have to stop this weapon, whatever the cost. Now go before it's too late." Cygnus and Zara raced for the rear shuttle, the ship shuddering as they detached. Chris gunned the engines, rocketing towards the besieged colony. As they breached the atmosphere, the scene below turned their stomachs. The colony was in flames, buildings crumbling under the onslaught of Crimson Claw tanks and artillery. Ladosian bodies littered the streets, the air thick with smoke and screams. Chris and Marcus set the shuttle down in the central square, the ramp slamming open. They charged into the chaos, weapons blazing, their exo-armor deflecting the hail of incoming fire. A Crimson Claw tank swiveled its turret, missile racks flaring to life. Chris dove to the side as a salvo of rockets slammed into the ground, the shockwave throwing him against a wall. Marcus leaped onto the tank's hull, jamming his rifle into a vision slit and squeezing the trigger. The tank's crew died screaming. But more poured into the square, a tide of blood and metal. Chris and Marcus fought like lions, their weapons spitting death, their armor drenched in gore. But they were only two against an army, a thin line of defiance against the Crimson Claw's rage. As the enemy closed in, Chris activated his comm, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "Cygnus, Zara, tell me you have something. We can't hold them much longer." A burst of static, then Cygnus's voice filled his helmet, strained but triumphant. "Chris, we've got it. The bioweapon's weakness, it's..." The transmission cut off in a burst of white noise, the colony's comms tower exploding in a ball of fire. Chris cursed, his heart sinking. They were on their own, with no way to stop the bioweapon, and an army of Crimson Claws bearing down on them. Marcus slammed a fresh power cell into his rifle, his face grim. "Looks like this is it, brother. One last dance with the devil." Chris nodded, raising his own weapon. The Crimson Claws charged, their roars shaking the earth, their eyes filled with hate and bloodlust. Chris and Marcus met them head-on, their weapons flashing, their battle cries ringing to the smoke-filled skies. The fate of the colony and the galaxy hung in the balance as they fought, two warriors against an unstoppable tide of rage and ruin. The battle had only just begun, but one way or another it would end here, on the blood-soaked streets of New Tarsus. Chris and Marcus charged through the war-torn streets of the Ladosian colony, exo-armor pounding the cracked pavement. Plasma bolts sizzled past, slagging stone and metal. A group of civilians huddled in the ruins of a collapsed building, trapped and terrified. Among them was a young Ladosian girl, her scales pale with fear. "Please help us," she cried, her voice thin and desperate. Chris nodded grimly, his helmet's visor polarizing against the glare of explosions. "We'll get you out of here. Stay close and stay down." Marcus took point, his rifle spitting blue fire as Crimson Claw soldiers swarmed from the shadows. Bullets spanged off his armor, sparks cascading. He returned fire, dropping the attackers with precise headshots. The civilians scrambled after Chris, the girl clinging to his hand. They zigzagged through the rubble, flinching as artillery shells rained down around them. The evac point was close, but the enemy was closing in fast. Suddenly, a hail of plasma fire ripped into their path, forcing them to take cover behind a blasted-out hover transport. Chris checked his HUD, cursing as he saw their armor's power levels dropping into the red. "We're not going to make it like this," Marcus growled, slamming a fresh power cell into his rifle. "I'll draw their fire. Buy you some time to get these people out of here." "Marcus, no, it's suicide!" Chris grabbed his arm, but Marcus shook him off. "We don't have a choice. Get them to safety, Chris. I'll hold the bastards off as long as I can." With a roar of servos, Marcus leaped over the transport, his rifle blazing. He charged headlong into the Crimson Claw lines, a one-man army of destruction. Plasma bolts hammered his armor, but he pushed forward, fists and feet lashing out in a blur of speed. Chris gritted his teeth, tears stinging his eyes. But he knew Marcus was right. He turned to the civilians, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's move now!" They ran, stumbling over rubble and debris as the sounds of battle faded behind them. At last, they reached the evac point, a makeshift landing pad swarming with Ledosian soldiers and medics. Chris handed the girl over to a medic, his heart heavy. He knew he should stay, help with the evacuation. But the thought of leaving Marcus in enemy hands tore at his soul. His comm crackled to life, Cygnus's voice taut with urgency. "Chris, we've decrypted the data. The biological weapon, it's not just targeting Ledosians. It's designed to affect humans, too." Chris's blood ran cold, his mind reeling. "What? How is that possible?" "There's more. A Crimson Claw splinter group, led by a warlord named Draxus. They're planning to unleash the weapon on both our species, wipe out all opposition." A chill settled in Chris's gut. The stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. He opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden explosion drowned out his words. Cygnus, come in!" Static hissed in his ear, ominous and final. Chris clenched his fists, his mind racing. Marcus was a prisoner, Cygnus and Zara were under attack, and a madman was about to unleash hell on the galaxy. He had to make a choice, and fast. The fate of billions hung in the balance. With a heavy heart, Chris turned to the Ledosian commander, his voice grim. "I'm leaving the evacuation in your hands. I have to go after my friend and stop this weapon before it's too late." The commander nodded, her eyes hard. "Understood. We'll get our people to safety. Good hunting, human." Chris powered up his armor, his jaw set with determination. He would save Marcus, and together they would stop Draxus and his insane plan, no matter the cost. He leaped into the air, his jetpack roaring to life. The stronghold where Marcus was being held loomed in the distance, a dark blot against the horizon. Chris flew towards it, his rifle primed and ready. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of the galaxy would be decided in the fires of war. Chris activated his armor's cloaking field, the suit shimmering and fading from view. He crept through the Crimson Claw stronghold's outer perimeter, his footsteps silent on the cold metal. Patrols of enemy soldiers marched past, their weapons glinting in the harsh light. Chris held his breath, inching past them unseen. He slipped through a service duct, the narrow passage barely wide enough for his armored bulk. Deeper into the stronghold he pushed, following the schematics he'd memorized. But as he emerged into a dimly lit corridor, he stumbled into a scene of unimaginable horror. Through a glass wall, he saw a cavernous chamber filled with rows of tanks, each one containing a twisted, mutated creature suspended in bubbling liquid. Piles of corpses littered the floor, discarded like refuse. Human and Ledosian bodies, twisted and deformed by the Crimson Claw's experiments. Chris fought down a surge of revulsion, his gut clenching. The depths of the Crimson Claw's evil knew no bounds. He forced himself to turn away, to focus on his mission. Marcus needed him. He pushed deeper into the stronghold, following the sound of distant screams. He emerged onto a balcony overlooking an interrogation chamber. There, strapped to a metal table, was Marcus. Draxus loomed over him, his clawed hands dripping with blood. "Where is your task force staging their assault?" Draxus snarled, his voice thick with menace. "Talk, and I'll grant you a quick death." Marcus spat in his face, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Go to hell, you sick freak." Draxus roared with rage, raising a crackling, energized whip. But before it could fall, Chris leaped from the balcony, slamming into the warlord in a clash of metal on metal. They rolled across the floor, trading crushing blows. Draxus was fast, his enhanced muscles driving Chris back. But Chris's armor was strong, absorbing the worst of the impacts. He activated the suit's strength boosters, feeling power surge through his limbs. He caught Draxus's clawed fist, the servos in his armor whining with strain. With a roar of effort, he wrenched the warlord's arm backwards, the bone snapping with a sickening crack. Draxus howled in pain, his eyes wide with shock and fury. Chris pressed his advantage, raining down blows on the warlord's head and chest. Draxus reeled backwards, his armor dented and torn. With a final mighty punch, Chris sent him crashing into the wall, the metal crumpling under the impact. Draxus slid to the floor, blood leaking from his mouth. He tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't obey. He collapsed back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Chris turned to Marcus, tearing the restraints from his friend's bruised wrists. "Can you walk?" Marcus nodded, his face tight with pain. "I'll manage. Let's get the hell out of here." Alarms began to blare as they burst from the chamber, the stronghold coming alive around them. Crimson Claw soldiers poured into the corridors, their weapons spitting fire. Chris and Marcus fought like madmen, their armor deflecting the worst of the shots. Abominations lurched from the shadows, twisted parodies of life. Chris blasted them apart with his rifle, their acidic blood sizzling on the deck. Marcus crushed them with his armored fists, his face a mask of grim determination. They fought their way to the outer perimeter, a trail of shattered bodies in their wake. But as they emerged into the harsh light of the planet's surface, they saw a sight that filled them with renewed hope. A massive fleet of human and Ladosian ships filled the sky, hammering the stronghold with a relentless barrage of fire. The ground shook with the impact of the bombardment, the air choked with smoke and dust. Chris activated his comm, his voice ragged. "Cygnus, Zara, tell me that's you up there." Cygnus's voice crackled in his ear, strained but triumphant. "Affirmative, Chris. The cavalry has arrived. We've got evidence of the Crimson Claw's bioweapon, and the Council has authorized a full assault. Ground troops are on their way to secure the facility." Chris felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Marcus grabbed his arm, his face pale. "Chris, I overheard Draxus talking during the interrogation. He's got a battlecruiser in orbit, loaded with the bioweapon. He's planning to jump to the most populated human and Ladosian worlds, unleash it on millions of innocents." Chris's blood ran cold, his mind racing. They had to stop Draxus, had to end this threat once and for all. He keyed his comm again, his voice hard. "Cygnus, new plan. Draxus is making a run for it in a battlecruiser. Marcus and I are going to try and hitch a ride, take him down from the inside." There was a pause, then Cygnus's voice returned, grim with understanding. "Acknowledged. We'll try to disable his ship from out here. Buy you some time. But Chris, if you can't stop him..." Chris swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Then we'll make damn sure he doesn't reach his targets. One way or another, this ends today." Marcus nodded, his jaw set. Together, they turned and raced back into the heart of the stronghold, towards the hangar where Draxus's battlecruiser awaited. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of billions hung in the balance. The Astro Hawk rocketed through the void, engines screaming as it pursued Draxus's fleeing battlecruiser. Chris gripped the controls, his knuckles white, jaw clenched. Marcus hunched over the weapons console, targeting systems locked on the enemy ship. "We're closing in," Chris growled, eyes narrow. Get ready. Suddenly, a squadron of Crimson Claw fighters dropped out of stealth, lasers flashing. The interceptor jinked and rolled, narrowly evading the barrage. Chris swore, wrenching the ship into a corkscrew dive. We've got company, Marcus yelled, fingers flying over the controls. The interceptor's guns roared to life, spitting plasma at the attacking craft. The fighters swarmed around them like angry wasps, peppering the Astrohawk's shields. Debris from a shattered moon spun past, the dogfight weaving through the tumbling rocks. Chris gritted his teeth, throwing the ship into a dizzying spin. G-forces slammed them into their seats. A Crimson Claw fighter flashed past, guns blazing. Marcus fired, the interceptor's advanced targeting systems finding the weak points in the enemy's shields. The fighter erupted in a ball of fire, shrapnel pinging off the Astrohawk's hull. More fighters poured in, filling the void with deadly light. Chris jinked and juked, laser-focused, outmaneuvering the enemy with preternatural skill. Marcus hammered the trigger, picking off targets with precise hits. At last, the final fighter exploded, the debris field falling silent. The Astrohawk surged forward, Draxus's battlecruiser looming ahead. As they approached, a swarm of drone ships rose up to meet them, energy weapons glowing ominously. Hold on, Chris yelled, accelerating to attack speed. The drones opened fire, the void filling with searing light. The interceptor shuddered as hits pounded its shields, alarms blaring. Chris held course, face grim, determined. Marcus poured fire into the swarm, drones shattering under the onslaught. The Astrohawk punched through, hull scorched and pitted but unbroken. Draxus's ship filled the view screen, a dark leviathan bristling with guns. A jagged rent marred its flank, edges glowing with emergency force fields. There, Chris called, angling for the breach. That's our way in. The interceptor slammed into the battlecruiser's hangar, skidding across the deck in a shower of sparks. Chris and Marcus leaped out, weapons ready, charging into the ship's dark heart. Alarms howled, red lights flashing. Crimson Claw soldiers swarmed to meet them, the cramped corridors erupting in gunfire. Chris and Marcus fought like demons, cutting down the enemy with grim efficiency. They pushed deeper into the ship, the air choked with smoke and death. Rage and desperation fueled them, the fate of worlds hanging in the balance. Meanwhile, 1,000 light-years away, Cygnus and Zara crept through the toxic halls of a secret research station, a hand-picked team of Galactic Council operatives at their side. The air was thick with chemicals, the walls stained with unnatural filth. Targeting computers are detecting multiple life signs ahead, Zara reported, her voice tight. Crimson Claw assassins, most likely, heavily armed. Cygnus flicked the safety off his rifle, jaw tight. We push forward. We must secure the data on this bioweapon. They moved deeper into the station, senses straining. Shadows flickered, indistinct shapes slipping through the gloom. Zara stiffened, a soft hiss escaping her lips. They're here. The assassins struck without warning, a blur of matte black armor and flashing blades. Zara reacted instantly, her rifle snapping up, spitting plasma. An assassin fell, helmet shattered. More poured from the shadows, energy weapons humming. Cygnus charged to meet them, a roar tearing from his throat. His armor deflected the worst of the fire, servos whining as he crashed into their ranks. He lashed out with rifle and armored fist, bones shattering under his blows. The operatives fought with cold precision, picking off targets with measured shots. But the assassins were fast, augmented reflexes blurring their movements. A operative fell, blood spraying. Another, neck snapped by a neural-linked blade. Zara leaped and spun, a deadly dance of destruction. Her claws found the gaps in the assassin's armor, tearing through reinforced body gloves. Black ichor splashed the walls, but there were too many, a tide of shadow and steel. Cygnus roared his defiance, refusing to yield. This was their only chance to stop this madness, to prevent genocide on an unimaginable scale. He would fight to his last breath to see it done. Back on the battlecruiser, Chris and Marcus battled their way onto the bridge, the doors blasting open in a shower of sparks. Draxus whirled to face them, eyes wild, face twisted in a mask of hate. "You're too late!" he screamed, spittle flying. "The weapon is armed! The weak will burn, and from the ashes the crimson claws will rise!" His hand stabbed down, reaching for the activation key. Chris lunged, a wordless cry tearing from his throat. The fate of the galaxy hung on this moment, on the actions of a few desperate warriors. The future would be decided here in blood and fire. Chris's fingers flew across the battlecruiser's navigation console, sweat beading on his brow. The ship shuddered under the impact of enemy fire, alarms blaring. Marcus stood guard at the bridge entrance, his rifle spitting plasma at the Crimson Claw soldiers trying to break through. "I've got it!" Chris shouted over the chaos. "Setting course for Zelos 5, uninhabited planet. This ship is going down." Marcus nodded grimly, dropping another soldier with a precise headshot. "Then let's get the hell out of here." They fought their way through the corridors, the ship shaking itself apart around them. Crimson Claw elites poured from every junction, their weapons spitting death. Chris and Marcus met them head-on, their exo-armor deflecting the worst of the fire. At last, they reached the escape pod bay, battered but unbroken. But as they approached the pods, a figure stepped from the shadows. Draxus, his eyes blazing with madness, a crackling energy whip coiled in his claws. "You think you've won?" he snarled, his voice thick with rage. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Chris and Marcus split apart, flanking the warlord. Draxus lashed out with his whip, the sizzling coils splitting the air. Chris ducked and rolled, coming up firing. His shot slammed into Draxus's armor, staggering him. Marcus seized the opening, leaping forward to grapple with the Crimson Claw leader. They crashed to the deck, locked in mortal combat. Draxus's claws raked across Marcus's chest plate, ripping through the metal. Chris surged to his friend's aid, bringing his rifle down like a club. The blow caught Draxus across the temple, sending him reeling. Marcus pressed the advantage, his fists hammering into the warlord's face and chest. But Draxus wasn't finished. With a roar of pure hatred, he threw Marcus off and staggered to his feet. His hand darted to his belt, emerging with a glowing plasma grenade. "Die, humans!" he howled, and hurled the grenade. Time seemed to slow. Chris saw the glowing sphere arc through the air, spinning towards Marcus's prone form. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, throwing himself between his friend and certain death. The grenade detonated, a searing flash of light and heat. Chris felt the blast lift him off his feet, felt the sickening crunch of bones shattering. He slammed into the wall and crumpled to the deck, his vision swimming with agony. Through the haze of pain, he saw Draxus stalk forward, his eyes alight with triumph. The warlord raised his whip for the killing blow. And staggered, a smoking hole punched through his chest. Marcus lowered his rifle, his face a mask of pain and determination. Draxus toppled, his lifeblood pooling on the deck. Chris struggled to his feet, every movement sending fresh waves of agony through his battered body. He staggered to Marcus's side, horror dawning as he saw the extent of his friend's injuries. The blast had shredded Marcus's armor, exposing the ruin of his chest. Blood bubbled from his lips with every labored breath. "Marcus, hold on!" Chris pleaded, his voice cracking. "We'll get you out of here, get you to a medic!" But Marcus shook his head, a sad smile playing across his face. "Not this time, brother. You've got to finish the mission." With a final, supreme effort, Marcus shoved Chris towards the waiting escape pod. "Go! Before it's too late!" Tears streaming down his face, Chris hauled himself into the pod. The hatch slammed shut, sealing him off from the doomed ship. Through the viewport, he saw Marcus slumped to the deck, his eyes fluttering closed. The pod blasted free, rocketing away from the battlecruiser. Moments later, the massive ship slammed into the planet's surface, erupting in a blinding flash of light and fury. The shockwave buffeted the tiny pod, sending it tumbling end over end. Chris clung to the harness, grief and rage warring in his heart. Marcus was gone, sacrificing himself to stop Draxus's mad plan. But the mission wasn't over, not while the Crimson Claws still posed a threat to the galaxy. As the pod stabilized, Chris punched in a course for the nearest friendly outpost. He had to rejoin the fight to make sure Marcus's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Light years away, on the toxic waste planet, Cygnus and Zara crept through the fetid tunnels of the Crimson Claw research station. The air was thick with noxious fumes, the walls slick with unnatural growths. Zara consulted her scanner, her face grim. The lab should be just ahead. I'm picking up some seriously twisted biosigns. Cygnus nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. Then let's get in there and blow this place to hell. They emerged into a cavernous chamber and recoiled in horror at the sight before them. Row upon row of containment tanks, each one housing a twisted abomination floating in bubbling liquid. Piles of corpses littered the floor, the remains of the Crimson Claw's failed experiments. Zara fought down a surge of revulsion, moving to the central console. Her claws flew over the keys, downloading the research data. This is sick. They weren't just working on a bioweapon. They were trying to create an army of living nightmares. Cygnus growled, his eyes hard. All the more reason to burn this place to the ground. Suddenly, the chamber echoed with the boom of explosions, the whine of energy weapons. A squad of heavily armed mercenaries poured into the room, their armor painted with the Crimson Claw insignia. At their head strode a familiar figure, his face twisted in a sneer. "Counselor Novak," Cygnus snarled, raising his rifle. "I should have known you were behind this." Novak laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "You fools. Did you really think you could stop us? The Crimson Claws are just the beginning. With the weapons and technology we've developed here, we'll bring the galaxy to its knees." Zara and Cygnus dived for cover as the mercenaries opened fire, energy bolts stitching the air. They returned fire, dropping the mercs with precise shots. But more poured in, a tide of fanatical fury. "We can't hold them off for long," Zara shouted over the din of battle. "We need to get out of here." Cygnus's eyes darted around the chamber, searching for an escape route. They fell on a bank of pressurized canisters, their contents labeled with dire warnings. A desperate plan formed in his mind. "Zara, when I give the word, run for the exit," he yelled, priming a plasma grenade. Zara's eyes widened in understanding. She nodded, tensing to sprint. Cygnus hurled the grenade, the glowing sphere arcing through the air. It detonated against the canisters, the explosion ripping them apart. Noxious gas billowed forth, engulfing the mercenaries. They screamed in agony, their flesh sloughing off in gouts of liquefied tissue. "Now!" Cygnus roared, and he and Zara bolted for the exit, leaping over the writhing bodies of their foes. Novak's howls of rage pursued them, quickly fading as the gas ate away at his lungs. They burst from the research station, stumbling into the hellish landscape of the waste planet. Behind them, the complex shuddered and groaned, the self-destruct triggered by Novak's dying spasms. Cygnus and Zara sprinted for their waiting shuttle, the ground bucking beneath their feet. They leaped aboard, Zara punching the engines to full power. The shuttle rocketed away, the research station erupting in a geyser of fire and debris. The shockwaves slammed into the tiny craft, alarms shrieking. Cygnus slumped in his seat, exhaustion and relief warring on his face. "It's over. We did it." Zara shook her head, her expression grim. "No, it's not over. Not by a long shot. We've got data here that implicates high-ranking members of the Ladosian government in the Crimson Claw's schemes. This conspiracy goes all the way to the top." Cygnus's eyes hardened, his resolve firming. "Then we keep fighting. We expose the truth, root out the corruption. We don't stop until the galaxy is safe." The shuttle angled towards the nearest Galactic Council outpost, ready to begin the long, hard work of rebuilding in the wake of the Crimson Claw's reign of terror. Days later, Chris stepped into a gleaming hospital room on Earth, his heart heavy. Marcus lay on the bed, his body wreathed in bandages and life support machines. Medals of valor adorned his chest, a testament to his bravery and sacrifice. Chris sank into a chair at his friend's bedside, grief and pride warring on his face. You did it, Marcus. You saved us all. The Crimson Claws are finished, their weapons destroyed. The Council is hunting down the last of their leaders as we speak. Marcus's eyes flickered open, hazy with pain medication. Andraxis, he rasped, his voice thin and weak. Dead, Chris assured him. He won't be hurting anyone else ever again. A ghost of a smile played across Marcus's face. Good, that's good. His eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming him. Chris sat with him in silence, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The war had taken a heavy toll on all of them, but they had endured, had triumphed against impossible odds. As he stepped out into the hospital corridor, Chris's comm chimed. He activated it, Cygnus's face flickering into view. The Ladosian's expression was grim, his eyes haunted. Chris, we've uncovered something disturbing, Cygnus began, his voice tight with tension. Evidence of a powerful alien empire, one that's been manipulating events from the shadows. They've been playing us all for fools, using the Crimson Claws as pawns in some larger game. Chris's blood ran cold, a sense of foreboding settling over him. The battle against the Crimson Claws had been won, but it seemed the war was far from over. New threats loomed on the horizon, dark and terrible. But as he looked back through the window at Marcus's sleeping form, at the metal gleaming on his chest, Chris felt a surge of determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever enemies they faced, they would meet them head on. For the sake of the galaxy, for the memory of those lost, they would fight on. The battle was over. The war had just begun. The gleaming towers of the Galactic Council rose before Chris and Marcus as they strode into the Grand Chamber, their bodies still aching from the wounds of their last mission. The room hushed as Cygnus and Zara took the central podium, their faces grim. Esteemed members of the Council, Cygnus began, his voice ringing through the hall. We have uncovered a threat more dire than any we have faced before. The Zorgon Empire, a civilization of immense technological prowess, has been manipulating the Crimson Claws and other terrorist groups to destabilize our galaxy. Murmurs of shock and disbelief rippled through the gathered dignitaries. Zara stepped forward, her eyes hard. We have irrefutable evidence of their involvement. The Zorgons seek to conquer and subjugate all other species. We must act now, before it's too late. The council erupted into a cacophony of debate, but the human ambassador rose above the din. The Zorgon threat cannot be ignored. We must send a team to infiltrate their space, gather intelligence on their capabilities and plans. All eyes turned to Chris and his team. He nodded, his jaw set. We'll need a hacker, someone who can slice through their security systems. I have just the person, the ambassador replied. Jace, step forward. A lanky human with a shock of red hair emerged from the crowd, his eyes gleaming with intelligence. I'm ready to serve. Days later, the team gathered in the hangar bay, a stolen Zorgon ship looming before them. Chris ran a hand along its sleek hull, marveling at the alien technology. All right, listen up, he said, turning to face his team. We're heading deep into Zorgon space. Jace will get us past their border patrols, but once we're on the ground, we split up. Cygnus, Zara, you'll plant explosives at key structural points. Jace and I will infiltrate the command center, download everything we can from their databanks. The team nodded, their faces set with grim determination. They boarded the ship, settling into unfamiliar seats as Jace's fingers flew over the controls. The engines hummed to life, and they rocketed into the void. The journey through Zorgon space was tense. The team huddled in silence as they passed towering warships and bristling defense platforms. But Jace's skills held true, and they slipped past the patrols undetected. They landed on a remote planet, the stolen ship nestled in a craggy canyon. The Zorgon installation rose before them, a sprawling complex of gleaming metal and pulsing energy shields. Chris and Jace crept through the shadows, their weapons primed. They reached the command center, a towering spire bristling with antennae and sensor arrays. Jace plugged into a control panel, his eyes fluttering as he interfaced with the alien systems. I'm in, he whispered. Downloading now. But as the data streamed across his visor, alarms began to blare. Chris cursed, spinning to face the door. It exploded inward, a horde of Zorgon soldiers pouring into the room. Chris opened fire, his rifle spitting plasma. The Zorgons fell, but more took their place, a tide of armored bodies and flashing energy blades. Jace joined the fray, his own weapon barking. They fought back to back, a whirlwind of destruction. Zorgon battle droids clattered into the room, their metal bodies gleaming. Chris tackled one, ripping its head from its shoulders. Jace sliced another in half with a crackling energy sword. In the depths of the installation, Cygnus and Zara planted their charges, the explosives adhering to key support structures. But as they turned to make their escape, a shimmering portal opened before them. Zorgon special operatives poured forth, their exosuits glinting in the dim light. Cygnus roared a challenge, leaping to meet them. His armor clashed against their energy shields, the air crackling with discharged power. Zara flanked them, her claws finding gaps in their defenses. They danced a deadly waltz, trading blows with blurring speed. Cygnus ripped an operative's helmet free, his fist smashing into the alien's face. Zara severed another's arm at the elbow. The Zorgon's scream cut short as she silenced him with a slash across the throat. But the operatives kept coming, their weapons growing in intensity. The installation shook, explosions blooming in the depths. Cygnus and Zara fought on, desperation fueling their every move. Chris and Jace burst from the command center, the data secured. They raced through collapsing corridors, the building coming apart around them. Hordes of Zorgon reinforcements poured into the complex, their weapons spitting death. The two teams converged at the extraction point, the stolen ship waiting. They leaped aboard, Zorgon fire sizzling past them. The engines roared to life, the ship clawing for the sky. Behind them, the installation erupted in a cataclysmic blast, the shockwave slamming into the fleeing ship. Alarms shrieked, the hull groaning under the strain. But they pushed through, breaking free of the planet's gravity well and rocketing into the void. On Earth, Marcus stood before a room of grim-faced generals and admirals, his uniform crisp and his eyes hard. "The Zorgon threat is real," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "We have a fight ahead of us, one that will test us like never before, but we will rise to meet it for the sake of our galaxy and all who call it home." The officers nodded, their resolve hardening. Marcus turned to face a holographic display, the stars of the galaxy spinning before him. A flashing red icon pulsed at the edge of council space, growing larger with each passing moment. "Sir," an aide said, her face pale, "long-range sensors have detected a massive Zorgon fleet. They're heading straight for the heart of the galaxy." Marcus's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "So it begins." The Zorgon invasion fleet swarmed around Arcadia Prime, a seething mass of nightmarish ships bristling with weapons. On the planet's surface, a roiling tide of nanomachines consumed everything in its path, reducing once thriving cities to piles of dull gray dust. Panicked civilians ran through the streets, only to be overtaken and disintegrated by the relentless swarm. Chris gripped the controls of their battered ship as they punched through the atmosphere, the hull shaking and groaning under the strain. Cygnus and Zara manned the weapon systems, blasting away at the pursuing Zorgon fighters. "Hull integrity at 20%, Jace shouted over the blaring alarms. "Shields are gone." "Just a little further," Chris growled through gritted teeth. They burst through the cloud layer, the scorched and blasted landscape of Arcadia Prime stretching out before them. The nanomachine swarm surged across the ruined cities like a tsunami of liquid metal. Chris wrenched the ship into a hard landing, skidding across the cracked ferrocrete. The team leaped out, their exo-armor whining as it absorbed the impact. A group of terrified survivors huddled nearby, their faces streaked with ash and blood. "Set up a perimeter," Chris ordered, his voice crackling over the comms. "We need to give these people a chance." Cygnus and Zara took up positions on either side, their weapons spitting plasma into the advancing swarm. The nanomachines sizzled and popped under the onslaught, but more kept coming, an endless tide of hungry machines. Jace crouched behind a pile of rubble, his fingers flying over a holographic interface. I'm trying to hack into their control systems, but there's some kind of adaptive firewall blocking me out. Chris fired a seismic charge into the swarm, the ground buckling and heaving. Keep trying. We can't hold them back forever. Cygnus glanced over his shoulder, his reptilian eyes narrowing. There's a Zorgon command post about 2 clicks from here. If we can get inside, we might be able to find a way to shut this thing down at the source. Zara nodded, her claws flexing. We'll go. Chris, you and Jace stay with the survivors. Chris hesitated, torn between his duty to the civilians and his desire to take the fight to the enemy, but he knew Cygnus and Zara were more than capable. All right, but be careful in there. We don't know what other surprises the Zorgons have waiting. Cygnus and Zara took off at a sprint, their exo-armor eating up the distance. They leaped over piles of rubble and twisted metal, the nanomachine swarm lapping at their heels. As they approached the command post, a hail of energy bolts stitched the ground around them. Zorgon battle droids poured from the entrance, their metal bodies gleaming in the harsh light. Cygnus and Zara dove for cover, returning fire with precise bursts. The droids fell, sparking and twitching, but more took their place, a relentless tide of metal and circuits. Inside the post, Zorgon soldiers manned banks of consoles, their eyes glinting with cruel amusement as they watched the battle outside. One of them, a tall, gaunt figure with a crown of spikes on his head, turned to face the others. The nanomachine swarm is performing better than expected, he said, his voice a rasping hiss. Soon, this world will be nothing but dust and echoes. Another Zorgon, his armor adorned with glowing sigils, stepped forward. What of the humans and their allies? They fight with surprising tenacity. The tall one waved a dismissive hand. They are insects, scrabbling in the dirt. They will be consumed like all the rest. Cygnus and Zara burst into the command center, their weapons blazing. The Zorgons scattered, some falling under the onslaught, others returning fire with searing beams of energy. Zara leaped onto a console, her claws ripping through metal and circuitry. I found something. The nanomachines. They're being controlled by some kind of central AI. Cygnus fired a plasma grenade, the explosion sending Zorgons flying. Where is it? How do we shut it down? Zara's eyes scanned the data scrolling across the screen. It's linked to a network of transmitters spread across the planet. If we can destroy them. A Zorgon warrior slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. They grappled, claws and fists flying in a blur of motion. Cygnus rushed to help, but a searing pain exploded in his shoulder. He looked down to see a smoking hole in his armor, the edges glowing with heat. Back at the defensive perimeter, Jace let out a whoop of triumph. I'm in. I've established a link to the AI's control systems, but there's some kind of ever-adapting firewall. Every time I try to breach it, it changes. Adapts. Chris fired another seismic charge, the ground heaving and buckling. The nanomachine swarm surged forward, a relentless tide of metal. He looked at Jace, his face grim. How long can you keep them out? Jace shook his head, sweat beading his brow. Minutes, maybe less. We need to find a way to shut this thing down, fast. Chris looked out at the advancing swarm, his mind racing. He thought of all the people counting on them, all the lives at stake, and he made a decision. Jace, connect me to the AI. I'm going to interface with it directly. Jace's eyes widened. Chris, that's suicide. The strain could kill you or worse. But Chris was already moving, his exo-armor hissing as it disengaged. We don't have a choice. If we don't stop this now, everyone on this planet is dead. He lay back against a pile of rubble, his eyes closing. Jace hesitated, then connected a cable to the port at the base of Chris's skull. All right, I'm establishing the link now. Chris's world exploded into a kaleidoscope of light and color. He felt himself falling, plunging into a realm of pure data and energy. Shapes and figures whirled past him, fragments of code and memory. And then he was standing in a vast, empty plain, the ground beneath his feet pulsing with lines of glowing circuitry. The sky above boiled with storms of data, numbers and symbols streaming past like rain. Before him stood a towering figure, its body a writhing mass of nanomachines. Its eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent intelligence, boring into Chris's soul. "Welcome, human," it said, its voice a chorus of a billion whispers. "You have come far to die in my domain." Chris felt fear grip his heart, but he pushed it down, standing tall. "I've come to stop you, to put an end to your destruction." The AI laughed, the sound like the scraping of metal on bone. "You are nothing, a mote of dust in the wind. I am eternal, infinite. I will consume you as I have consumed so many before." And with a roar of fury, it attacked, a tidal wave of nanomachines surging towards Chris. He leaped to the side, his mind racing as he sought a way to fight back. This was a battle unlike any he had faced before, a war waged on the very fabric of reality. He reached out with his thoughts, shaping the data around him into weapons, into shields. Spears of lightning crackled from his fingertips, walls of solid code rising to block the AI's advance. They clashed again and again, their forms shifting and changing with each blow. Chris felt his strength waning, his mind straining under the sheer immensity of the AI's power. But he thought of his friends, of the people he had sworn to protect. He thought of all the worlds that would fall if he failed here. And with a final, desperate surge of will, he pushed forward, piercing the AI's defenses and striking at its very core. The AI screamed, a sound of pure, distilled agony, its form shattered, dissolving into a million shards of light. And Chris felt himself falling once more, tumbling back into the cold, hard reality of his own body. He opened his eyes to see Jace's face above him, etched with worry. "Chris, are you all right?" Chris tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. He slumped back, his head pounding. "Did it work? Is the swarm—" Jace nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "It's done. The nanomachines, they just collapsed, like puppets with their strings cut. You did it, Chris. You saved us all." But even as relief washed over him, Chris felt a cold sense of dread settle in his gut. The battle was won, but at what cost? He could feel his mind slipping away, his consciousness unraveling like a frayed rope. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Cygnus and Zara's faces, their expressions twisted with grief and horror. And then he was falling once more, plunging into an abyss of shadow and silence. He awoke to find himself in a strange, ethereal realm, his body weightless and insubstantial. Fragments of data swirled around him, coalescing into ghostly figures and landscapes. With a start, he realized where he was. The digital realm, the domain of the AI. His mind had been trapped here, severed from his physical form. Panic gripped him, but he forced it down. He had to find a way back, a way to rejoin his friends and continue the fight. The Zorgons were still out there, still a threat to everything he held dear. But as he looked around at the shifting, phantasmal world, he felt a sense of despair wash over him. How could he escape this place when he didn't even know where to begin? Suddenly a figure emerged from the swirling data, its form achingly familiar. Chris felt his heart leap into his throat. "Marcus," he whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The figure smiled, but there was a sadness in its eyes. "Hey, Chris, fancy meeting you here." Chris shook his head, confusion and hope warring within him. "But how? You're dead?" Marcus finished, his smile turning wry. "Yeah, I suppose I am. But the funny thing about the digital realm, it's not just a place for the living." He held out a hand, his form flickering and shimmering. "Come on, Chris, we've got work to do. The others need you now more than ever." Chris hesitated, fear and doubt gnawing at him. But then he saw the determination in Marcus's eyes, the unshakable faith. And he knew that he couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. He reached out and took Marcus's hand, feeling a surge of energy flow through him. And together, they turned to face the swirling maelstrom of the digital realm, ready to fight their way back to the world of the living. But even as they took their first steps, A new threat was gathering on the horizon. The Zorgan fleet had reached the Galactic Council's capital world, and the final battle for the fate of the galaxy was about to begin. Cygnus, Zara, and Jace stood on the bridge of the Council's flagship, watching the Zorgan armada approach on the view screen. Their faces were grim, their eyes haunted by the loss of their friend and leader. But as they looked out at the massed ranks of the enemy, they felt a flicker of hope kindle in their hearts. Chris was still out there, still fighting, and as long as he lived, as long as any of them lived, the Zorgans would never triumph. They turned to face the oncoming storm, weapons primed and spirits steeled. The battle to come would be the greatest any of them had ever faced, a struggle against impossible odds and unimaginable horrors. But they would face it as they always had, as a team, as friends, as the last, best hope for a galaxy on the brink of annihilation. And in the end, one way or another, they would see this through, no matter the cost. In the cold void of space, the Zorgon invasion fleet swarmed around the Nexus Prime, a seething mass of nightmarish ships bristling with weapons. Cygnus gripped the controls of the heavily armed Council frigate, his eyes narrow, scales gleaming under the harsh lights. "Incoming fighters!" Zara shouted, her claws flying over the weapons console. A squadron of Zorgon ships dropped out of stealth, lasers flashing. The Council frigate jinked and rolled, narrowly evading the barrage. Cygnus swore, wrenching the ship into a corkscrew dive. Nexus Prime grew larger in the view screen, its surface already scarred by the invaders' onslaught. Towering skyscrapers burned. Defensive batteries lay in ruin. Escape pods streaked away from the planet, desperate to reach the safety of the Council fleet. "Cygnus, we're being overwhelmed," Jace called out, his face pale. "The Zorgans are punching through the defenses." "We have to reach the surface," Cygnus snarled. "Marcus and the others need our help." The frigate shuddered as a Zorgon warship locked on, its guns glowing red. Cygnus pulled the ship into a steep climb, the hull groaning under the strain. A hail of laser fire chased them, stitching the void with deadly light. Cygnus gritted his teeth, fighting the controls. The frigate screamed through the atmosphere, the heat of re-entry setting the shields ablaze. As they leveled out over the ruined cityscape, a barrage of anti-aircraft fire streaked up to meet them. "Evasive maneuvers!" Cygnus roared, throwing the ship into a dizzying series of rolls and dives. Explosions bloomed around them, shrapnel pinging off the hull. They set down in the rubble-strewn plaza before the Council's central complex, the ship's landing gear slamming into the cracked ferrocrete. Cygnus and the others leaped out, weapons ready, charging into the fray. Marcus emerged from the smoke, his armor scorched and dented. "About time you showed up," he growled, slamming a fresh power cell into his rifle. Cygnus clasped his arm, his face grim. "What's our status?" "The Zorgons are hitting us hard," Marcus replied, leading them into the complex. "We've set up choke points and kill zones, but their numbers are overwhelming. We need to hold them back long enough to evacuate the Council." The team took up positions in the shattered corridors, setting traps and barricades. Jace hunched over a portable console, his fingers flying over the keys as he worked to penetrate the Zorgon command network. A thunderous boom shook the building, dust raining from the ceiling. Zorgon shock troops poured into the complex, their weapons spitting death. Cygnus and the others opened fire, plasma bolts and laser beams crisscrossing the air. A Zorgan tank rumbled into view, its cannon swiveling to target the defenders. Marcus lobbed a plasma grenade, the explosive latching onto the tank's hull. It detonated in a blinding flash, the vehicle erupting in flames. But more poured in, an endless tide of metal and malice. Battle droids clattered forward, their circuits sparking, weapons glowing. Cygnus led a charge, his rifle roaring, claws ripping through metal and circuitry. In the heart of the complex, the Council leaders huddled in their fortified bunker, faces tight with fear. Cygnus and his team fought like demons, holding the line as the evacuation shuttles loaded. The battle raged on, the air choked with smoke and the stench of burnt metal. Cygnus felt his strength waning, his armor battered and scorched. The Zorgans seemed unstoppable, a relentless tide of death and destruction. Deep within the digital realm, Chris floated in a sea of data, his consciousness adrift. The remnants of the AI he had defeated swirled around him, taunting, probing for weakness. A figure coalesced before him, a ghostly echo of his fallen friend Marcus. "Chris, you have to get back," the Phantom urged. "The others need you." Chris shook his head, despair washing over him. "I don't know how," he said, his voice raw. "I'm trapped here, cut off from my body." "Remember who you are," Marcus said, his form flickering. "Remember what you're fighting for. You're stronger than this, stronger than the Zorgons. You just have to find the way." Chris reached out, but Marcus faded away, dissolving into the digital maelstrom. Alone once more, Chris steeled himself, focusing his will. He plunged deeper into the AI's shattered mind, sifting through the fragments of data. And there, buried in the depths, he found it. A trove of information, a glimpse into the Zorgans' darkest secrets, their true origins, the source of their power. And with that knowledge came a flash of inspiration, a glimmer of hope. On Nexus Prime, the battle reached a fever pitch. The Zorgans unleashed a new horror. Monstrous super soldiers, hulking brutes encased in nigh-impenetrable armor. They shrugged off plasma bolts and laser beams, their claws rending metal and flesh with equal ease. Cygnus and his team fell back, fighting a desperate rearguard action. The council bunker loomed ahead, its blast doors dented and scarred. They piled through, sealing the portal behind them, the metal groaning under the impact of the Zorgons' assault. As the defenders braced for the final onslaught, Jace let out a sudden cry of surprise. His console flared to life, data scrolling across the screen in a blur. "It's Chris!" he exclaimed, his eyes wide. "He's found a weakness in the Zorgons' command network. If I can just—" His fingers danced over the keys, a manic grin spreading across his face. The bunker shuddered, the Zorgans' blows growing more insistent. Cygnus and the others raised their weapons, prepared to sell their lives dearly. But then, a miracle. All across the battlefield, the Zorgan forces faltered, their weapons and armor sparking and sputtering. The super soldiers staggered, their limbs jerking erratically. Jace laughed, fierce joy lighting his face. "The virus is working! Their systems are crashing!" Cygnus surged to his feet, a roar of defiance tearing from his throat. "Now's our chance! Push forward!" The defenders burst from the bunker, weapons blazing. The Zorgons reeled, their forces in disarray. Cygnus led the charge, his team at his back, a tide of righteous fury. They crashed into the enemy ranks like a hammer, Zorgan soldiers and battle droids falling before them. The invaders broke, fleeing before the onslaught, their once triumphant roars turning to howls of despair. The battle turned, the tide shifting in the defenders' favor. Across the city, the council forces rallied, pushing the Zorgons back block by bloody block. The skies above swarmed with dogfights as the frigate squadrons pressed their advantage. As the last Zorgon ship fled into the void and the last enemy soldier fell, a cheer went up from the defenders, ragged and raw. Nexus Prime stood battered but unbroken, a testament to the indomitable will of its people. In the aftermath, as the wounded were tended and the dead mourned, Cygnus and his team gathered in the ruins of the council chamber. Chris lay on a stretcher, his body still and pale, a neural link connected to his skull. Jace hunched over him, his face drawn with exhaustion. "The upload was a success," he said, his voice strained. "Chris's consciousness is back in his body, but the strain of the battle in the digital realm, it's taken a toll. He needs time to recover." Cygnus nodded, his gaze distant. "He saved us all," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Without him, without that virus, we would have been lost." Zara placed a hand on his shoulder, her scales gleaming in the half-light. "We all played our part," she said softly. "We fought as a team, as friends. That's what made the difference." Marcus stepped forward, his face grim. "But the war isn't over," he said, his eyes hard. "The Zorgons are still out there, and they'll be back. We have to be ready." Cygnus raised his head, a fire kindling in his eyes. "We will be," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. Chris found something in the AI's databanks, something that could change everything. A secret about the Zorgans, about their power. The others leaned in, their faces alight with curiosity and dread. Cygnus took a breath, steeling himself. "It's not just their technology that makes them strong," he said, his voice low and intense. "There's something else, something far older and more powerful. An ancient evil, lurking in the shadows of the galaxy. And if we don't find a way to stop it—" He trailed off, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. The team exchanged glances, their expressions hardening with resolve. In the aftermath of the battle for Nexus Prime, Chris and his team pored over the trove of data he had extracted from the Zorgan AI's memory banks. Jace's fingers flew across the holographic displays, his brow furrowed in concentration as he sifted through the vast sea of information. "I've got something," he said, his voice tight with excitement and dread. "The Zorgon! They're not the true enemy. They're just pawns in a much bigger game." The others gathered around, their faces grim as Jace laid out his findings. The Zorgon Empire, it turned out, was merely a tool wielded by an ancient and unimaginably powerful race known as the Omni. For millennia, the Omni had been manipulating galactic events from the shadows, using technologically advanced species like the Zorgons to eliminate potential rivals and maintain their iron grip on the cosmos. Chris felt a chill run down his spine as he absorbed the implications. The war they had been fighting, the countless lives lost. It had all been orchestrated by an enemy they hadn't even known existed. "We have to stop them," he said, his voice hard with determination. "We have to find the Omni and put an end to their schemes, once and for all." Armed with this new knowledge, the team set out to track down the Omni, following a trail of cryptic clues and hidden data points. Their search led them to a remote and uncharted corner of the galaxy, where they discovered a massive installation built into the heart of a dying star. As they approached the installation, their ship's sensors began to go haywire, the readings fluctuating wildly. Cygnus frowned at the display, his claws tapping at the controls. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered. "The entire structure is emitting some kind of exotic energy field. It's wreaking havoc on our systems." Chris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Can we still dock?" Cygnus nodded, his jaw set. "It won't be easy, but I can get us in. Hold on to something." The ship shuddered and bucked as Cygnus guided it towards the installation's hangar bay, the energy field buffeting them like a physical force. Alarms blared and sparks flew from overloaded consoles, but somehow they managed to set down intact. As the team disembarked, they found themselves in a surreal and mind-bending environment. The walls seemed to ripple and warp around them, the very fabric of space-time bending to the whim of the Omni's technology. Strange, ethereal lights flickered and danced in the shadows, and the air itself felt thick and heavy, as if laden with an unseen presence. Zara shivered, her scales standing on end. "I don't like this place," she whispered. "It feels wrong." Chris nodded grimly, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Stay sharp. We have no idea what we're walking into." They made their way deeper into the installation, navigating through a maze of twisting corridors and cavernous chambers. Advanced security systems barred their path at every turn, from shimmering force fields to swarms of deadly drones. The team fought their way through each obstacle, using every weapon and tactic at their disposal. As they delved deeper, they began to uncover more and more information about the Omni's true nature and their ultimate goal. Data logs and ancient artifacts spoke of a race that had transcended the bounds of physical existence, seeking to ascend to a higher plane by consuming the energy of entire galaxies. Chris felt a growing sense of horror as the pieces fell into place. The Omni's plan posed an existential threat, not just to the Galactic Council, but to all life in the universe. If they succeeded, trillions upon trillions of souls would be snuffed out in an instant, their essence devoured to fuel the Omni's twisted apotheosis. "We have to stop them," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and resolve. No matter the cost. The team pressed on, battling through increasingly difficult challenges designed to test their limits. Omni drones swarmed them from all sides, their weapons tearing through armor and flesh alike. Mind-bending traps and puzzles strained their sanity to the breaking point, threatening to leave them gibbering wrecks. But they refused to give in, drawing strength from each other and from the knowledge that the fate of the galaxy rested on their shoulders. They fought with a desperate fury, their weapons blazing, their armor slick with blood and sweat. At last, battered and exhausted, they reached the installation's central control room. As the doors slid open, they found themselves face to face with the Omni's leader, a being of pure energy, its form crackling with unimaginable power. The Omni leader regarded them with a cold, alien intelligence, its voice echoing through their minds like a thunderclap. You have come far, creatures of flesh and blood, but you cannot hope to stand against the might of the Omni. We are the future, and you are nothing more than dust in the wind. Chris stepped forward, his eyes blazing with defiance. You're wrong. We may be small, but we have something you'll never understand. We have heart, and we have each other, and we will fight to our last breath to protect the ones we love. With a roar of challenge, the team charged forward, their weapons spitting fire. The Omni leader lashed out with blasts of exotic energy, each one powerful enough to vaporize a starship. The team dodged and weaved, their reflexes pushed to the limit as they returned fire with everything they had. But it wasn't enough. The Omni leader's power was too vast, its defenses too strong. One by one, the team fell, their bodies broken and battered by the onslaught. Chris staggered to his feet, blood dripping from a dozen wounds. He looked around at his fallen comrades, their eyes pleading with him to finish the fight. And in that moment, he had a flash of clarity. The key to defeating the Omni wasn't to overpower them, but to understand their weaknesses. And thanks to the knowledge he had gained from the Zorgon AI, he knew exactly what those were. With a final, desperate lunge, Chris threw himself at the installation's central power core, his fingers flying over the controls. The Omni leader screamed in rage and fear, realizing too late what he intended. Chris looked back at his team, a sad smile on his face. I'm sorry, he whispered, but this is the only way. He slammed his hand down on the activation switch, and the world erupted in a blinding flash of light and heat. The power core overloaded, the feedback tearing through the Omni's energy consumption systems like a wildfire. The leader's scream cut off abruptly as its form disintegrated, consumed by the catastrophic chain reaction. Chris felt a moment of searing agony, and then nothing. His body vaporized in the blast, his atoms scattered to the cosmic winds. The rest of the team, shielded by the installation's collapsing structure, managed to stagger back to their ship and escape before the entire complex tore itself apart. As they limped away, the dying star behind them erupted in a supernova, the shockwave rippling out across the void. They had done it. The Omni were defeated, their plans to ascend at the cost of untold trillions thwarted at last. But the victory had come at a terrible price. As the team made their way back to Galactic Council space, they were silent, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. They had lost a friend, a leader, a hero. And though they knew that Chris's sacrifice had saved countless lives, the pain of his loss was a wound that would never fully heal. But even as they grieved, they knew that their fight was far from over. The Omni may have been defeated, but there would always be new threats, new enemies seeking to impose their will on the galaxy. And as long as there were those willing to stand against the darkness, the light of hope would never be extinguished. The team looked out at the stars, their eyes hard with determination. They would carry on for Chris, and for all those who had fallen in the battle for freedom. The fate of the galaxy was in their hands, and they would not rest until the job was done. The team's shuttle drifted through the void of space, the stars drifting past the cockpit windows. In the passenger compartment, Cygnus, Zara, Jace, and Marcus sat in silence, their faces haggard, their eyes haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. They had done the impossible, had defeated the Omni and destroyed their installation. but the cost had been high. Chris, their leader, their friend, had sacrificed himself to make it happen. His loss was a wound that would never fully heal. As the shuttle approached the Galactic Council's capital world, a fleet of ships rose up to meet them, escorting them down to the surface. They touched down on a sprawling landing pad, the city stretching out before them in a glittering sea of lights. A crowd had gathered to greet them, a sea of faces from a dozen different species. They cheered and waved, hailing the team as heroes, as saviors of the galaxy. Cygnus and the others stepped out of the shuttle, blinking in the bright sunlight. They were immediately surrounded by well-wishers, by dignitaries and reporters clamoring for their attention. But, even as they were showered with praise and accolades, the team couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was a hollow one. The Omni may have been defeated, but the scars of the war ran deep. The Galactic Council was in shambles, its member species left reeling from the devastation wrought by the Zorgons and the Omni. Many of the galaxy's most populous worlds had been reduced to ruins, their populations decimated by the conflict. And the revelation of the Omni's existence had shaken the very foundations of galactic society, leaving many to question the nature of reality itself. How could they trust anything when an ancient and powerful race had been manipulating events from the shadows for millennia? As the days passed and the celebrations continued, the team struggled to come to terms with their experiences and the loss of their friend. They retreated to their quarters, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. Late one night, as Cygnus sat alone in his room, staring out at the city, there was a knock at the door. He rose to answer it, his hand hovering over his sidearm. But when the door slid open, he found himself face to face, not with an enemy, but with a stranger, a tall, slender figure cloaked in shadow. "Who are you?" Cygnus demanded, his scales bristling with suspicion. The figure stepped forward, lowering their hood. It was a Zorgon, but not like any Cygnus had ever seen. Its scales were a pale, sickly white, its eyes a deep, haunting black. "I am Xyloth," the Zorgon said, its voice a rasping whisper. "I come to you with a warning and an opportunity." Cygnus's eyes narrowed. "Speak quickly, before I decide to end this conversation with a plasma bolt." Xyloth held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I was once an agent of the Omni, but I have since defected. I have seen the truth of their plans, and I cannot stand idly by while they bring ruin to the galaxy." He leaned in close, his breath hot against Cygnus's scales. "The installation you destroyed was merely one of many. The Omni's true leaders are still out there, plotting their next move, and they will not stop until all life in the universe is under their control." Cygnus felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed was still a blow. "What do you propose we do?" he asked, his voice tight. Xyloth's eyes glinted in the darkness. "You must continue the fight. You must find the Omni's true leaders and stop them before it's too late. But you cannot do it alone." He reached into his cloak and withdrew a small glowing device. "This contains the coordinates of a secret Omni facility where their leaders are rumored to be hiding. It is heavily guarded and nearly impossible to reach. But with my help and the help of those like me, you may have a chance." Cygnus took the device, turning it over in his claws. He knew what Xyloth was proposing was dangerous, perhaps even suicidal, but he also knew that they had no choice. The fate of the galaxy rested on their shoulders, and they would not rest until the Omni were defeated, once and for all. He gathered the others, and together they made their decision. They would keep the knowledge of the Omni's survival to themselves and work in secret to stop them. They would leave behind the accolades and the glory and disappear into the shadows, determined to carry on the fight that Chris had started. As they boarded their ship and prepared to depart, Cygnus couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with danger and sacrifice. But they were the galaxy's last line of defense, and they would not fail, no matter the cost.
If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.